I'm going to tell you about a study that Ellen and I conducted here at IWH last year, and we're doing a subsequent one right now, and that's having some very exciting data coming forward that's confirming what we did before. So what this is about is looking at co-workers' experiences of work reintegration, and I now know from experience that you cannot see that at the bottom of the slide, which is a reference to the publication. But I believe the slides will be published, so if anyone wants to find that reference, they can. Likewise, simply Google our names and you'll soon see it. Okay, now I know you like these slides, and I know that I did show them here before, but I have to show them once again. So I am from rural Australia, but a bit like Canada, rural is not very far from the seaboard before it's rural. So I'm from the University of New England, which is in Armidale, New South Wales. Now, I know the important places are Melbourne, where Peter and Iggy are. So they're down here. This is Sydney. This is Brisbane. So Armidale, where I am, is about halfway in between. So it's about a 5.5-hour drive, and then you have about another 5 hours to go to get to Brisbane. So when you visit Australia and you want to take the inland route instead of going along the coast, you call in at Armidale and you can stay at my house for the night. Sorry? I wish that was my house, as long as I had lots of domestic staff. Now, that is the main administration building of the university. It was actually a grand English country mansion, and the estate was bequeathed to education in Australia in the 1930s. This was a English gentleman's country home, and so it was initially an annex of the University of Sydney, but it became a university in its own right in the 1950s. And the key teaching that we do is via distance education, and we've always been a forerunner in distance education. Now, of course, with the net, you can go anywhere in the world. And it's interesting, it's giving us quite a competitive edge because we're used to doing that. So, yes, that is the main building, and it's a lovely building, and you can have coffee and sit out here on the veranda. So when you visit, we'll do that. We do have other modern buildings, obviously, but I teach in the graduate program, teaching clinical psychology students, and this is our clinic, the former laundry of the Grand Mansion. It's a heritage listed building, so it's really problematic doing things with it, but that's where we actually see clients for our training. And I've only left one more of the Australian slides because I know you like these too. These are actually on our campus. This is outside my window. These guys are around at the moment because it's spring. They're active. And the campus is just a few kilometres right from the heart of the town, which is still relatively small. But it's in a bushland setting. So we have these guys around everywhere, and the parrots and the cockatoos as well. So, yes, it's very pleasant. Okay, now on to what I really want to tell you about. The current situation, this is just the background to this study. So the current situation, as you know, is that there are key stakeholders that everyone's aware of in the work reintegration process. So these are the employer, the ill or injured worker, the insurer, and healthcare providers. And probably many of you are familiar with this ARENA model, which considers those different dimensions, but we have the worker as the focus of what's happening in rehabilitation. We also know, though, from research that workplace interventions are really important. They are clinically relevant because they're actually modifiable. We can do something about that. Sometimes we can't do something about, people's ages or the nature of their injury. And that these type of interventions are really important for work reintegration. Hence, we have early return to work and, that modified duties process. Yet, as we look at it, when you look at work reintegration, and although it's based on a biopsychosocial model, and everyone tells us that, what we actually find is that there's pretty much a focus on modifications and accommodations that are addressing physical aspects of the job or medical issues. That's still what we tend to go for. And again, the research of Ellen and Osatulian has shown that there's still really very little recognition of environmental conditions and workplace social aspects in work reintegration. So I was really interested in this because what I know from organisational psychology, it's very clear that the workplace is a social environment. And in organisational psychology, we know that people are, all employees are partners in social and task interactions. There's a social interaction that goes on as well, and that this is quite independent of the supervisor. So the kind of outcomes that we see that co-workers influence, and this is very well documented in the organisational psychology literature and HR literature, that co-workers influence how we perceive our job, what and how to do things. I was here last week and I didn't know how to do the graphics scanner thing or what the password was. So that's not in any job description someone gives me. So I go and ask a co-worker. That's how we know how to do things and how things go. Our co-workers also determine our work attitudes, how satisfied we are, how involved we are, how committed we are. If we're in a nice work team that shares our work ethic, who's working hard, we're all working hard together as a team, that changes how we feel. But if, we're there and people are, being nasty to us and, they all go home at 4 o'clock and you're still there at 5:30, you think, well, why should I be? So, our co-workers and how they treat us and how they react make a big difference to us. And they certainly affect withdrawal behaviours. As I've already indicated, how hard we work can really be influenced by our co-workers and whether we actually want to leave a place. It's usually because of how the co-workers go. You can have a bad manager or an unpleasant manager, but if you've got nice co-workers, you kind of, feel that sense of collegiality. But when it's the other way round, it's a strong cause for you to leave. And we certainly know, we hear in the literature that co-workers will leave, a returning employee will leave because co-workers have been unsupportive and, uncivil to them. So they affect our personal and then ultimately the organisational effectiveness. And again, organisational psychology tells us that this influence of co-workers can vary from positive and supportive, it's on a continuum, to negative, antagonistic. So you can have people that are just not overly friendly to people being quite abusive and awful. So along that continuum, and whether you have support or antagonism and how much will impact variably on those outcomes that are listed above. So we know all of that about co-workers in general. So the question was in relation to co-workers in work reintegration. So we certainly know that they're generally absent from policy. They are not a stakeholder. We know from existing research that they may have to vary their duties to their detriment. They may have to do things. They may not get to do the light duties. They have to do all the heavy duties. Or they may have to do extra duties, pick up the slack to make it work. We'd already heard that. And their efforts may not be recognised, yet we read in a number of the Workers' Compensation Authority literatures that, they know that they're crucial, and it's stated there. It's stated in Australian literature, New York State co-workers are crucial to return to work success. But what we found was that what is known about their role comes from the report of others, and that co-workers really hadn't been given a voice to say how it is for them, and so we wanted to know what that was. So a different perspective was required. This is the actual document that WorkCover Tasmania put out, and they say co-workers are crucial to the success of return to work. But within that, they make this statement. Some of you I know can't see. I'll read it. It says, a supportive workplace culture is key to making workplaces more enjoyable and somewhere that injured workers are motivated to get back to. So the co-workers being happy is still all about making it good for the injured worker. But we thought we need a different perspective. So we're having a look under the water at how this is going instead of looking at what's swimming around on the top. So we wanted to know, what is happening from the co-worker's point of view. Here we have the returning injured worker who's got, a lumbar disc bulge and has been off work with back pain. And here are his co-workers. He's doing the light duties, he's supervising, and these guys are actually, getting on with digging the hole. So we want to know what is happening from the co-worker's point of view. So our research question was, what is the experience of people working alongside someone who's come back to work after injury? How are co-workers involved in this process? What do people expect of them, and how does it work out, and what changes over time? What are the challenges and the things that influence how they respond? And what maybe could we do that would make co-workers more supportive, given that all that we're hearing is they need to be supportive to help this go well? So there was only limited knowledge about this, so we did an exploratory qualitative study. We had 13 co-workers and we ran 3 1.5-hour focus groups. We had open-ended questions and we added new questions as things emerged, and then we engaged in an iterative analysis of to and fro with some difficulty over the email and the Skype and to analyse this data. I can tell you just a little more about the sample too. There were 5 men and 8 women. Their mean age was 38.5 years. The range was 21 to 62. And the inclusion criteria was they had to have worked alongside a returning injured worker within the last 3 years. And we chose them for diversity. So we had a call centre operator, a public relations officer, a college teacher, a concierge, a male room attendant, a warehouse labourer, a receptionist, legal secretary, military officer, soldier, pest control technician, landscape gardener, fitness centre manager, and baggage handler. So a lot of different occupations. So these are our results. Yes?
How did you find them?
Aha! This was something different I hadn't done before. We found them via Craigslist. So we put an advertisement saying that we were academic researchers and we were looking for people who had previously had this experience. So it was under sort of jobs, etc. kind of category. And we said that we were offering an honoraria. And so I had to screen these people, of course, because there were some people there who were in it for the money. It wasn't very. It was $50 and a free lunch. So that's how we got them. It was we had I have to tell you this slight anecdote. I've got a moment. We had one chappie come. He was very polite because they're given the information consent form when they arrive, and my university ethics committee required that the people be paid the honoraria on arrival so that they could meet the criteria that they could leave at any time and were free to go. And so this was in the information statement. So this one young chappie comes along and he's helping himself to the sandwiches and the drinks and whatever. And then he says, before we start, is it right what it says here that I can go and there's no penalty at any time? I said, that's right. He said, okay, thank you. And off he went. I'm sure that doesn't usually happen.
You didn't count that one.
So that was amazing. So I'll just go through and give you a bit of a summary of the key results and try to give you some of the words that people said to us. So what we found was the group was generally understood the rationale of what this was all about and why we have work reintegration. So we had our landscape gardener, Joe, and he said, it's a sense of being accommodating, bringing someone back and still having them part of the workplace, and when they're ready, they'll get back to their old job, you know. I'll give you another comment that Joe made later. So they all sort of had this little, they had the rhetoric. They kind of understood what it was about, but it was quite a different thing in the reality. So that was interesting. Quite strongly, though, they expressed the view that they are not the people responsible for this, that they often found themselves in situations where they had responsibility without control. So we had Nabal here saying, these of course are not photographs of the people involved. These are just, off the web. And he said, if someone gets injured, it's between the employee and the employer. It has nothing to do with you. And another of the participants said, we're just there to do the work. This is not our responsibility. But they realised responsibility was put on them without very little control or impact or input. So it's a precarious business, this. What we found was that work reintegration was seemingly useful to the returning worker and tolerable to the co-workers, depending on the quality of the work reintegration arrangements. Now I'm going to describe those for you a bit more in subsequent slides. What the relationship was like with the injured worker prior, or if they had one at all. What the workplace culture was like, and how privacy and confidentiality was managed, or what kind of communication went on around the return to work process. What we found, though, were the arrangements were often haphazard. The co-worker and the returning worker were left without support. It often seemed unfair to the co-worker and the returning worker what went on. Duration was an issue. Goodwill ran out. People can put up with things for a couple of weeks, but once it goes on for a long time, that's a different story. And it was okay, though, if things changed, but the overall demands didn't change. So in one instance, we had a woman who was the legal secretary. Her colleague came back. She had a carpal tunnel problem. And anyway, the supporting worker was given relief from typing. She did some other things, but, the duties were moved around, so the demands weren't hugely increased on her. But we had Denise who said, this is what went down for her. The supervisor pulled me aside and said, you've got this person coming, keep her occupied. They, the management, they didn't even pretend to be interested. They just said, keep her occupied. It was really stressful for me. And what happened with this particular woman, she was actually the head of a newsletter department within a very large organisation here in Toronto, and the person that came to them was a young woman who'd suffered a stroke, and she subsequently had aphasia. And she also had a scar where she'd had a tracheotomy. So she was put in this totally new work team where there was no pre-existing relationships. No, they weren't told what her problem was. She had great communication difficulties. So this team leader was trying to support this poor young woman who was often distressed in the circumstances. She's having to do her work at night because she's trying to help this girl during the day. The girl ended up going off on stress leave and finally, didn't come back to work. It was a very sad story. But she was just, they just look after her. You'd hope things went better. We expect that things go better, but this was just astounding. So, the quality of the relationship with the returning worker, that really impacted how willing the co-workers were to give support if they liked the person and they had a previous relationship. Well, they were just, the blokes on uni holidays working together. This was all fine. But that relationship sometimes seemed to impact how the co-workers perceived what the injured worker was doing. If they didn't like the person, then they had negative perceptions of how that person was behaving. It was also dependent on the person complying with rules, and we'll see what Joe said there. But actually, we later found there are a lot of rules that make support contingent, stated or unstated. And as I explained with the previous one, it was really affected by a change in work team. So if people were put somewhere where they had no relationship with that work team, there was no, the support was, very marginal, if at all. So what Joe says here was, oh no, this is not the rules one. This was where sort of negative perceptions can occur. And this was a guy that actually also said up front, look, it's good, they come back, they do these duties, and when they're all better, it's fine, they're back. He said there was a pattern developed where I think he knew he could get away with it. And then by midweek he'd be like, well, my arm's hurting. So, he used to go and sit in the truck. And he said, my workload doubled, and then just the stress, because he was quite demanding. So Joe's with this poor returning worker whose arm probably was hurting midweek. He's having to do landscape gardening. But Joe was getting pretty annoyed that this guy's going to sit in the truck, but he'd not worked with this guy before. So he had a negative attitude towards him straight up, like I reckon he's just trying to get away with it. The rules one was the military fellow. He said, look, we all help each other out, and this is what we do, as long as you don't complain and, you give it your best shot. So there's rules. And, of course, the workplace culture. We found workplace cultures, as we know, some of us not here, it's terrific, but, supportive or unsupportive. Sometimes it's collegial. And it makes a difference if you're in a team and got to work together compared to being autonomous. So we had this particular worker, Heather, who had two experiences. She was a temp agency person, and she described herself, I imagine she was on reception. She said, I do the low totem work. That's not a phrase we use in Australia. There were quite a few phrases I heard in these focus groups, like the woman from Alberta, you know what they're like. I went, no. Anyway, it was interesting. So she was in one workplace that she said was really supportive, everyone got on, and, a person came back and she said, look, you have to pitch in. I felt it was part of my responsibility. A spoke on a wheel, one gets broken, the rest of us help it out. Then, and so she sort of had this, then as this thing went on towards the end of the time, she talked about another workplace where she's talked about it being really hostile. She said, I really didn't care about the other person. So this is another injured worker in another workplace. I came, I filled my hours, I left. The toxic environment didn't lead to good relationships. So we had a person who really had values of wanting to help and support, but was quite different in her own behaviour in two different environments. Big issue was privacy and confidentiality, and this strongly impacted on the work reintegration process because of how information was exchanged between management and the co-workers, and the co-workers' input to the work reintegration process. Many of the co-workers felt left out from the whole early contact component. They wanted to have contact with people while they were off, but they were often not permitted to because they weren't given details. And the fact that they weren't given information, it was the co-workers' view that this was actually detrimental to everyone, the returning worker and to themselves, because they didn't know about the person's condition or enough about what was going on to really give the support that they thought they could. They would have recommended different things because they actually knew the job if someone had asked them. One of our participants said, if they'd have only listened. But no, we're nobody, we're just there to do the work. And it did lead to rumours and speculation because people weren't given the facts. So this particular nice, the legal secretary lady, she said, Gillian, I was told she's sick. But of course the management, they wouldn't tell us what the problem was. It was very sad because she's such a nice lady and I wanted to send her a get well card or something like that. So the point of early contact is to maintain social relationships and to maintain people's social connection with the workplace. But these workers who are the peers, the co-workers, were not permitted. And this was something that was, most of them said, unless they had some pre-existing personal relationship that they continue. But if they were just a peer that they saw around the table and didn't have contact details, they couldn't proceed. So overall, our specific findings were that there was little or no effect on the co-workers when modified duties were performed for a short period of time. So we can all do a bit extra or put ourselves out for people for a couple of weeks, not months. If there's a collective social environment and there's a sense of reciprocity, and this is part of what already happens in the work team, and you do a bit more of this and I do a bit more of that. If we're used to that, that went quite well. As I said before, if additional staff were employed to meet the extra demands, the difficulties really came when there was one staff member down, and so the person who's performing modified duties is only performing part of those duties, and other people were having to do the extra. And there was one person that actually said he benefited because he got the chance to perform higher duties. He was the pest control technician, and he was in a small business, and it was his employer. It was actually not a horizontal, a vertical relationship. So he had to step up and help with managing the organisation, and for him that was great because he learnt new skills and had a new opportunity. But for all the people on the horizontal level, they didn't tell us about that. The detrimental effects for the co-workers came in when work reintegration was implemented in a minimalist fashion. And by that I mean just a technical change to the job. Okay, this person's coming back, they can only do these tasks, end of story, rest of you guys, you take care of it. No communication, no input, no involvement. And that came down to poor communication when they just didn't have information enough to do the job. When they weren't part of it, they weren't involved. I had an interview with a senior person this week who said, you've got to get the co-worker buy-in. I said, well, how do you do that? I said, well, when they see that it's all being done, according to a proper return to work plan. How do they do that? Anyway, that's another study. And it didn't go well when the person was just plonked in a new team. Again, a big organisation here in Toronto, the mechanic was taken from, I'll see if I can find you the quote, taken from doing mechanical type work and placed in to do clerical work. I mean, after all, anyone can use a photocopier and a computer, can't they? And this chappie, if I can find it, well, maybe I can't, I should have, right? No, I can't just see it right there now. But he had to come in, and she said, look, he didn't know how to do filing, he didn't know how to do a spreadsheet. All he'd used a computer for was, solitaire. And then the man became understandably annoyed about this, and he's saying, I shouldn't be having to do women's work. And so this sort of grumpy behaviour then affects all the rest of the clerical team. But, it was assumed, well, he can't do heavy work, so he can go and do clerical work. So we asked then the co-workers for some solutions to these negative impacts. So there was the extra work and the heavier work. There was that disruption to their own personal effectiveness because they had to support this other person or help them. There was disruption certainly to the organisational effectiveness. Things weren't getting done in the usual timely manner. The landscape gardener was complaining, they have high-end clients that he has to do this for, and these people aren't happy when this guy doesn't trim these hedges perfectly. There was certainly disruption of workplace social relationships. The poor young woman with the obvious scar that the other co-workers didn't understand what had happened. She has aphasia, she can't speak properly, they are particularly uncomfortable. They stopped having their little morning teas because they didn't want to have to ask her to come. Confronted with the injured worker's externalised distress, so that might have been anger. At other times, people observe the co-worker with a mental health problem just crying because she couldn't cope being back in an environment where she'd been traumatised, and the co-workers didn't know what to do. And the really tragic part is there were ripple effects. So we heard about the psychological distress of the co-workers having to cope with these extra demands, and one even spoke about her own personal injury because she had to do all the heavy work. Her co-worker was just receiving faxes and not having to lift parcels in a mailroom. She tried to say, she says to her employer, look, I can't keep doing this. They said, you want a job, you just do that. She gets a back injury, she goes off herself. So what they said might work would be, as we've said, for the replacement staff, much more effective communication, so they have some sort of understanding of the injury, that they might be consulted about the return to work plans, that they might give some guidance or assistance with that. They also made a really interesting point that people need to be sufficiently recovered to be able to do meaningful duties on the job. The baggage handler spoke about the person that came back to their group who just sat in the office and watched television all day because he wasn't fit to handle bags, but he wasn't fit for anything else. And he was bored and angry, and they were really resentful. If he was watching TV at home, it would have been different. And they just wanted some acknowledgement or consideration. And they said, look, it doesn't have to be money, but maybe, occasional personal day. One of them said, just, even a manicure or something. They gave us a manicure when we did whatever. But most of them said, we just want people to know what we're doing and just to acknowledge what's happening. So combining all of these literatures is the paper that Ellen and I have forthcoming soon. And what we've done there is to take these results and look at this in the wider context of the literatures from organisational psychology, from the traditional disability field and how accommodations have been provided for people there, from business and HR, and in particular justice theory, as to why we react in these ways that we do, why co-workers responses are what they are. So we're almost there, but just from the disability field, there's a lot of literature out there confirming exactly what the co-workers told us, that the attitudes towards a person being accommodated will be things about the employee themselves, about the employee being the accommodated, whether they like them, whether they were the cause of the injury or not, whether it was their own stupid fault or whether it's been some tragic accident, all sorts of things about them, the nature of the injury that they have. The co-workers' own values, of course. Some people are more inclined to want to, go the extra mile than others. The organisational climate and legal requirements. So there's actually quite a huge literature out there that we haven't tapped in work disability about how people respond to accommodations. So we've put it all together in a model, and I won't try to go through all of this for you, but over this side are the things that co-workers, the outcomes that they affect. And as I've said, in the middle we know that it can vary from being supportive to antagonistic, and that will impact these outcomes. We know that there's a set of features about the accommodation, about the worker, the injury, the co-worker and the environment. But what has come out in the broader literature, and we have actually some papers in work disability as well, that it depends, these all determine whether the co-workers see it to be fair or not. And if we think it's fair, if it's just, then it's okay. But if it's unfair to us, like I'm having to do more here, this is stopping me doing what I want to do, but, no one knows, no one cares, and she's still just fine. That's when it's going to impact whether we're supportive or antagonistic. But that's another talk. So, to conclude, co-workers are not a neutral party in this process. They are vital to the outcomes of returning injured workers. Work reintegration is not a mechanistic thing. Look, I've done it. I've been a rehab provider for 10 years. You write up the return to work plan, and the employer and the treating doctor, and you all agree, and you go, plunk, there it is. I never thought about the co-workers either. But these things occur in a social context, and we have to think about that. Yesterday I was speaking, I'm doing interviews, we're looking at managers now. What do managers see as the role of co-workers? And I was speaking to a manager yesterday, and I have to tell you this, and she said, well, they have to be supportive, and they can't undermine this, and they have to have the right attitude, and they have to facilitate things, and they have to be, this is their obligation under human rights. And I said, well, what happens when they don't? Well, we have to confront them. Oh, okay. And, co-workers have told us sometimes it's really hard for them, and goodwill runs out, and, it's difficult. And she said, well, it's a life experience. People have to work hard and be honest and be decent to other people. This is what we try to teach our children when we raise them, and this is how people have to be. And, oh my gosh. And then I said, well, some people mention sort of some incentives, maybe a day off here, or even just some acknowledgement. Well, I think that would be buying their goodwill, and we don't have to pay people to be nice. We just expect them to be. So, no recognition that people are in a social context. Then work reintegration is also not linear or static. It changes over time. And we know, look, I've reviewed the return to work plans, but I never ever thought of goodwill running out. So we are proposing that maybe there needs to be some consideration of formalising the co-worker role to make the process fair, and that might make outcomes better for everyone. But a big thing that we need to address is privacy and confidentiality issues. And while we have some thoughts around how that can be done, that is a major issue. So that is it. I would like to express my thanks here. First of all, for the CIHR funding that allowed for my visit here and my work with Ellen in particular. I could get a bit teary about this. Who's just been a fabulous mentor, a person for me to work with. And I also need to acknowledge my own school at the university, their School of Behavioural, Cognitive and Social Sciences, who have also funded me to be here right now. So I thank all of those groups, and I have some references there that will be available with the slides. Thank you.